Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining in. My name is Gary Eelman.
And I'm John Beradino.
And this is The Middle for Men. And today we're going to be talking about fathers and sons, which I think is a very interesting subject. And John and I have experience because we both have fathers and we both have sons. More importantly, John has seen a lot of issues that we're going to talk about today in his clinical practice. I have some thoughts of my own from my own life to share, some anecdotes. And so thanks for joining in. And if you enjoy our content today or any other of our episodes, please do hit the subscribe button. It helps a lot. Or give us a thumbs up also. That would be good. And anyway, on with the subject. John?
Yeah, it's a great topic because this is something you and I have discussed. I've talked about it with a lot of my friends. What is it that we experienced from what we encountered in our childhood with our fathers and what we encountered later on in our adult lives with our fathers that we wanted to discuss and bring out in a more meaningful way so that other people can kind of reference it as well in their own lives. One of the questions we had, what did I want my father to teach me back then that I need today? And so much of what we've concentrated on has to do with our own subjective experience. And I know you talked about idolizing your father because of what he educated you on. Mm-hmm. Mechanically and the things that you built together and what you learned from him in those experiences. And then for me, it was more about athletics and everything that I learned from my father in regards to baseball. That was the connection that we had together. But there were things that I wanted to learn from him that maybe I didn't have access to. And a lot of it had to do with stories. And the stories that aren't told to us that we wish we could have heard from our fathers when we were younger.
Sure.
And I think it gives us an incentive to pass along the stories of our lives to our sons today. But what do you think, Gary? Because one of the things I want to make sure is, what do you think some of the things were that you didn't get from your father that you wish you could have had?
Well, I had a loving relationship with my father. I was with him, living with him until I was 8 and a half, something like that. And then I went to live with my mom and my stepfather because my parents got divorced. But I did see him every weekend for a long time. He ultimately did go to California for like a year. But other than that year, I saw him virtually every weekend. I spent the weekend at his place, and we did a lot of things together. And if I look at, I have to consider myself fortunate in that regard because I have a lot of friends who, they just didn't spend that kind of quality time with their dad.
Yeah.
I was always with him, but he's married to somebody that I actually didn't like.
Yeah.
So it was kind of hard. But we did ultimately do things alone together or with my brother.
Yeah.
And that was fine. And my dad always expressed his love to us, both of us, always told us he loved us. So, I felt gratified in that because even my friends are around me. But you asked me what do I feel I didn't get from him? And what I didn't get from him was that as our relationship transitioned from me being a child and a teenager, later on as an adult, I think we began to, it became a chasm between us emotionally. And it had a lot to do, believe it or not, with my success. We ended up working for the same company, and I had climbed through the ranks. And as I did, instead of getting encouragement from him, and I think that would be the word, that I would coin, or maybe acceptance. He just seemed to grow more and more away from me and didn't want to talk about anything that I had done. And with my kids, I want to know what they're doing, what they're interested in, how their career is going. Yeah. I'll ask them questions like, well, are you enjoying it? Is this a place you think you're going to stay?
Yeah.
Where do you go from here?
Yeah.
My father never did that. Once I rose above a rank in the company that we were in, above him. In fact, it became I mean, it was just obvious that there was something between us, and even other people noticed it.
It's an interesting situation because what I've noticed is that, when I always do a history when somebody comes in during the intake session, and I'll ask them about their relationship with their dad. And what comes to mind usually is that if needs aren't met right away, if let's say there's a void, whether it's in physical affection or verbal affection, a son will make up a story in his mind in regards to the ways in which he perceives himself to his father. And we talked about approval. We talked about acceptance. We talked about wanting your father's pride,
right,
and how might that be expressed and experienced. Now, it depends on the environment that you're in. Baseball was the arena in which I knew I get it. So if I go 3 for 4, my dad's going to be happy. If I go 0 for 4 and I strike out a few times, he's not going to be happy. So there was a linear way for me to discern the ways in which I can enable that pride to occur.
Yeah.
But I also felt when I failed, or there was some defeat or some discomfort and experience that I had, I felt a tremendous kind of burden that was placed upon me, and a wound was developed. And then I started to make up a story in my head as to what I thought my dad might have thought of me.
Yeah.
And that could have repeated over and over again. And it affects you. It affects your identity, your feelings of self-worth and whatnot.
Absolutely.
But as we were talking about before, the seasons of our life, noticing that you can go from yearning for that as a child and then moving into adolescence, and some things start to shift a little bit. Mm-hmm. And what was it for you, Gary, when you went into adolescence that you thought might have changed for you in young adult life?
Well, one thing was I spent a lot less time with him, and as teenagers do, you start to hang out with your friends, and you develop your own distinct personality, move away from idolizing your father so much, and I think we all begin to see that he's human and has flaws and faults, and to the extent that you love someone, you accept those and move on with your life. But I think, in adulthood, I'd say right through my teenage years, I was still pretty close to him. I remember him saying when I was really young, he would hug me and kiss me, and when he dropped me off back at my house, he would always joke and say, "Someday when you're older and you have a beard, you won't do that with me." And I'd laugh and I said, "No, I'll always do that with you, Dad." Yeah. Well, he was right. I didn't always do that with him. But like I say, right through the teenage years, I think we remained pretty close. It wasn't really until I started working, and even then, I think things were going pretty well between he and I was lucky to have him because the things that I did get from him so far at that point outweighed everything else. He was a very passive person, never once raised his voice at me, never. And consequently, I think I've said this previously in a podcast, consequently, I never raised my voice at any of my children. I have 4 children, much less lay a hand to him. It wouldn't even cross my mind, and nor did it his. I think he spanked my brother and I once at my mother's insistence when we were like 7 or something. And he looked at my mother. He told me this story, and he said he looked at my mother afterward, and he said, "If you ever want that done again, you could do it your own fucking self," because it bothered him that much. He grew up in a his father, of course. I mean, we're going to talk about this, but descending down through the generations, your father, you are your father to some degree, or you rebel against that, and decide you're not going to be your father. Yeah. And I think I got the best parts of both of that. Yeah. And what I felt later in life that I didn't want from him was this sort of non-communication about your life and what's going on, and to stay interested in your life like he did when you were a child. So I think that's the part that I missed the most. Yeah,
I think for myself, growing up in a family of athletes, competition was always such an important part of the ways in which we oriented to the world around us, whether we won or lost or who came in first and things like this. So competition was a real value. I think when I moved into adolescence, what I started to recognize that as a way in which I oriented to the world wasn't as important. There was something about it that didn't really jive with me. what I started to recognize is that compassion was far more of a value for me. Collaboration, connection, my friendships were the central value that I had.
Yeah.
And I wanted to find ways to connect with them deeper, as opposed to finding some level of ascendance, amidst my friends group when it comes to athletics or whatnot. So I started to notice that, and I realized that this is not the competitive value. That wasn't something that I wanted to continue.
Right.
But to come to terms with that was really difficult for me. And it wasn't until I told my father that I didn't want to play baseball anymore that I really took a risk.
Wow.
And that risk for me was something that I recognized could disrupt and split asunder the relationship that I have with my dad. The irony was that I was completely wrong. My relationship with him got better.
Oh, really?
It did. And I think it's those assumptions that we have based upon what we're raised with that we need to challenge. To think that my dad only loves me because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And that was never the case.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it actually almost, and this is this is what I'm kind of conjuring up in my own mind, but it almost maybe gave him permission to be more affectionate with me. Because the affection wasn't contingent upon how well I did in sports, but rather something more organic to the dynamic that we had as a father and a son. And I know you and I talked about this notion of songs being an important conduit to connect with those emotions. Right before my father died, there was a great movie, Braveheart, that came out. Yeah. And it kind of had themes of this dynamic between the father and the son and some of the characters within it. And I'll never forget it because I went to go see that movie 4 times in the theater. I've never done that before. But it was around the time that he was dying of cancer, and it wasn't until later on I started to recognize, this is my way of connecting with the feelings that relate to what I was about ready to experience, which was his death and what that meant to me as a son. Mm-hmm. So, but I know you talked about some of the songs that made a difference in your life or the way in which you related to your dad, right?
Yeah, I don't know so much that they made a difference, but it just struck me as I was thinking it through when we were talking previously about, fathers and sons, that Fathers and Sons, Father and Son is the title literally of a song by Cat Stevens. Yeah. And I thought, geez, so this is not a subject that we're imagining, obviously. Right, We've talked to enough men, had enough friends, you know, and those you're close to, sometimes you do talk about these things. So, here's back in the 70s, Cat Stevens writes a song called Father and Son. Yeah. And it's about his growing up through and eventually breaking away from his father. Yeah. Because, one of the lines in the song is, from the moment I was born, I was told to listen. And I think a lot of, at that age when you're reaching manhood, the transition between that, I think a lot of men feel that that, it's time for me to stop listening and I gotta make my own decisions. And then Harry Chapin did a song called The Cat's in the Cradle, and both of these were big hits. So there's a reason for that, right? People could relate to them. People generally love songs that they can relate to in some way. And these were big hits. And my guess is that if you looked at it from a demographic perspective, I would guess there's a lot of men that were listening to those songs, right? Yeah. And I loved the song. It had an impact on me, for sure, an impact that was, these are beautiful songs telling beautiful stories. And because I was a guitar player and singer and all that, I learned both of them and could still play them both. Yeah. Because I've kept them through the years. Because they're such good songs. They're such solid songs. Yeah. But one of the things when you're talking about sports and your dad, the one thing I did notice from an early age on was that friends of mine connected with their dads through sports. Through sports, yeah, definitely.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah,
my dad wasn't the least bit interested in sports, and never talked to me about. And I don't think we ever talked about sports. He took me to a Phillies game once, and I was, to be honest with you, I was too young to enjoy it. I sat there bored for hours. I thought, God, what a friggin' slow game this is. I got to sit here and wait for, somebody to get a hit. Yeah. Nobody's getting. And it's not that I didn't play sports as a kid. I did. We all did to some extent. Yeah. It just wasn't anything he was into. Yeah. So we talked. He actually talked pretty deeply with me early on, much to the chagrin of my mother, because I became smarter and smarter about interpersonal skills, and emotions, and being able to establish a dialogue with somebody. And she didn't like that at all. She told him that, I wish he would stop talking to him about the war in Vietnam.
Oh, God.
But I loved it.
You loved it, yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
I wanted to know more. I had a thirst for knowledge.
Yeah.
In fact, my father took me to a demonstration in Washington, D.C. When I was probably 14.
Wow.
We stood outside in the rain and holding signs saying, stop the war. And Lyndon Johnson was peeking out from behind the curtains in the White House.
Yeah.
And at that time, you could get pretty close to the White House, so you could literally see people.
Yeah.
That's getting off the track there. But my point is that we just had a very different connection, and it definitely wasn't through sports. And yet, I would say 10-1 compared to my connection. Other guys that I grew up with, that was their connection on that sort of scale.
Yeah.
And they didn't ever talk about their dads in the way I talked about mine. It was just a very, very different thing.
It's an interesting dynamic, and I think one we probably gloss over just because it's just assumed. Sports is such a prominent part of the ways in which we relate to each other and connect. I mean, the Super Bowl just occurred, and I remember hearing the guys down on the field after they won saying, "I love you, man. I love you." And and I'm like,
"Now you love me.
Now you love me. Yeah, of course you do." But it is interesting the specific fields in which we feel we can allow that type of intimacy and connection. Sometimes we hear it after a tragedy or loss or death and things like this.
Absolutely.
And what I've noticed in working with veterans is that there was a deep, intimate connection with those individuals they fought with. Mm-hmm. But that's not really discussed. It's not talked about.
It's intrinsic but not outward.
It's not outwardly defined, described, referenced as a model,
right?
To kind of to understand and to explore and to maybe to delve deeper into. But I always noticed it as grief, and grief is always drenched with some element of love because there's loss of something that was meaningful. And that's why I think for me, what I noticed when I watched Braveheart, there were other movies like Legends of the Fall, Field of Dreams is one of them as well. Yeah. Where these kind of intimate encounters with other men, most notably family members like a father, you can kind of sense that it's allowed. I can embrace that model, and I can say, you know what, I can feel those feelings. I'll never forget. I looked over at my dad one time. We were watching the big movie, I guess in the 50s. I think it was Ben-Hur.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah. And I remember watching it during Easter, and I looked over. I saw him kind of crying.
Oh, really?
And I'd never seen my dad cry before.
Wow.
And it's interesting how a movie can elicit that.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating for me because I thought my dad was this kind of stoic, kind of, masculine, as we kind of reference it through these kind of stereotypical terms, like this figure that doesn't cry or show emotion. But I looked over and I said, oh my God, this is affecting him. I started to watch it more, and then it started to affect me. And I was like, was it the movie itself, or was it because I saw my father allow that emotion come out, and maybe it gave me permission to do it unconsciously as well. Yeah. So it's nice to have these mediums, whether it's music or movies, to bring that out for us.
Sure.
And to also reference that empathy, I think, is the psychological faculty that I think really kind of encourages that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we take that for granted. We mentioned this in the last episode that we had, but empathy and art are an important part of what helps to deepen our human experience, most notably with the people we care about.
Yeah. When I was young, my father and I connected through working on cars, working on projects. We had a boat. And it was always, my brother was already off to other things. He was older than me, but my dad and I did a lot together, and we would be teasing one another the whole time. We just had a ball working together.
Yeah.
And in fact, when he moved out here to be near us in his 80s, I said, I'm hoping you can come over and we can hang out in the garage and find something to work on like the old times. It never really happened because he was, too old to do that. Yeah. But as a kid, as a teenager, I would always bring over some piece of junk car because I couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
I was broke. My first car was $50, and then I moved up. My second car was $25. And we had to put these, I had to make these things run before I could get them inspected. In that state, you have to have a safety inspection and all that. But first it has to run.
Yeah.
And he was, he was loving enough and giving of his time enough that once he lived near us permanently, and I was old enough to go there, I'd just show up. I never had to call him or anything like that. His house was open all the time, and we would be working on things and constantly having fun. He would just make constant jokes about what we were doing, and I would too, and we would always be at one another because we would play this game where we'd put each other on, pretend that like I'd say, "That's not going to work, Dad," and he'd go, "Yeah, I think it'll work," and I go, "Nah, that's not going to work," and he goes, "Well, what would you suggest?" And just constant stuff like that, banter back and forth, and then obviously I was just, he was way knowledgeable. He was an engineer, as a electrical engineer, and had tremendous technical knowledge, which I benefited from a lot, I have to tell you, in my career, because he also took the time to explain to me, the things that I wanted to know and that I didn't understand, and that helped me a lot. So, yeah, that was good. But other guys I hung out with, like I had a very, very tight group of friends, and they saw my father as weirdly saw him as some kind of a hero as well. Yeah. Because he was so inviting to them. When they came over, he knew them all. I mean, he would talk to them, and he would, if they had a problem with their car, he would work on their car for them, and it's just great. So I have a funny story about that. But my friend Bob, turns out, we're now 16, and he's driving his dad's 1958 Ford or whatever it was, and we're just going to go out and bomb around. And Bob turns over. We're all going to smoke. We all smoked cigarettes at that point. And so the first thing Bob does is get out a cigarette, and he puts the cigarette in his mouth, and he turns around to get a light from somebody in the back, but he doesn't watch where he's going. And he hits a light pole. It's one of these giant aluminum light poles. Yeah. And I mean, the light pole comes crashing down across the car.
Oh, that's dead.
And Bob says, "Did I hit it?" But now the funniest thing is he goes, "Oh, what am I going to do?" He's scared to death of his father, right? Yeah. And we get out, and the fender is all crunched, the hood is crunched, and he's like, God, he goes, "Gary, do you think we could go to your dad's and maybe he could fix it for us?" And I just start, I'm laughing hysterically, and he goes, funny. "No, really, he can fix anything." Yeah. So we went and got my dad out of bed. I think it must have been 10 o'clock or something, and he comes out and he goes, "What do you want me to look at?" And I said, "Bob thinks you might be able to fix his car," but I didn't tell him anything. And then he came out, he looked at it, and we both just broke out laughing hysterically. And Bob's over there panicking. You know? So we had those kind of times together. But like I said, as an adult, everything just kind of changed, and that was really different.
Well,
and disappointing.
And I think one of the things we also want to discuss here, Gary, is how different we are from our dads.
Yeah.
In as much as we appreciate, we admire them, we love them. Yeah. You grew into a very different person than your father. But now you kept and held on to a lot of the values and obviously what he instructed you with and the guidance that he gave you and whatnot. But I think it's also good to know that you had the courage to change. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is.
Okay.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think I'm lucky enough, just incredibly fortunate to have had him as a father. Yeah. And yet, like I said, we all recognize that as we grow up, that our parents are human and that they have faults. And the fortunate part for me was I was able to pick out some gems that stayed
absolutely.
with me. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know people who, and I've gone through this with a couple of very close friends, and one of them in particular. We got talking about, our communication between fathers and stuff like that. And his dad owned the company, and he worked for his dad. And I knew his dad very well, and I never saw any sort of affection between them. And I just had the suspicion that there was this shadow over their relationship. Yeah. And I looked at him one day and I said, "Can I ask you, have you and your father ever exchanged terms of endearment? I mean, has he ever said to you, 'I love you'? Have you ever said that to him?" Yeah. And he said, "No, never." Yeah. And I said, you need to get that done. Can I tell you that as a best friend? Can I tell you that it
takes
important?
courage. It takes courage.
And he knew it.
Yeah.
I mean, he got nervous. He got uptight about it. And
Yeah.
I said, it's going to be, once you do it, it's going to be so easy. Yeah. But love needs to be expressed. And in a book by Leo Biscaglia, say his last name?
Biscaglia.
See, you're Italian. You can do that. I can't. I'm Dutch. Those words don't come easy. So I read his book, I think, in one of his first, maybe it was his first book, Love, What Life is All About. And I was impressed by it. In fact, it changed my life. And so I went on this sort of my own personal mission that when I got to know somebody well enough who seemed like they were deficient in those exchanges, I would encourage them. I would just talk about it.
Yeah, and it's fortunately you had the book. And I don't know how kind of well versed people are with Leo Biscaglia's his literature today and what he's written about. I know he did write a book about his father, which is interesting. But I think we all have, in some ways, stories that reference the way in which we relate to our experiences with our dad, and I think, as Biscaglia said, the greatest hazard is to risk nothing.
Right.
So there is courage that it comes with maybe not having the words or not knowing how to reference it, but just doing your best with trying to reveal it.
Sure.
And having a vulnerable moment with your dad and saying, I don't know.
Which my friend...
But I'd like to know.
Yeah, right. Which my friend ended up doing. And he told me about it, and he said, I was in his office, and we had just had a long talk about something, and it was business related. He said, but he said, I can tell you I had a lot of anxiety, but he said, I turned before I walked out the door, and I said, I love you, Pop. And he looked at me, and he said, he had his glasses on, he looked over at me, and he stared at me for a second, and he said, I love you too, son.
Yeah.
And he walked out, and he said, it's like the best thing that ever happened to me. And he said, if you hadn't pushed me to do that, because he died a couple years later.
Yeah.
And, anyway, I think it's just so interesting that the lack of courage to be vulnerable enough with between fathers and sons, and maybe from both sides. I don't know that if a father grows up heaping love on their son and expressing it outwardly, that a son wouldn't return that, and pretty easily from a young age, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you tell me.
Well, yeah, I think, look, Maya Angelou had a great quote. She said, there's no greater agony than bearing the untold story inside of you. That there's literal legitimate pain that comes from holding in your own personal story, or perhaps the ways in which you've cut off any access to hearing your father's.
Yeah.
We need to know these things, and rarely do we hear I wish I never told him that.
Yeah.
We say, I wish I would have revealed this to him. I wish I would have said this more. I wish I would have expressed this more often. So we have to take into consideration, I think, the moments that we kind of foreclose on because it might create anxiety, like your friend, but also maybe notice that there are mediums that can encourage us. It could be a song. It could be a Cat Stevens song or Harry Chapman song. It could be a movie like Field of Dreams. The reason as to why Field of Dreams was significant to me, and I think for many men, is because of Kevin Costner's character. It took this courage. It wasn't just like, he wanted to reconnect with his dad. That wasn't it. In fact, he had a lot of animosity towards his dad. Mm-hmm. But the story itself kind of unfolds with where he takes these risks himself, like plowing the cornfield so that he can create this baseball field, so he can connect with this voice that's kind of calling, if you build it, he will come. And he's who's the he? And then that is shoeless Joe Jackson. Oh, that's who the he is. Yeah. And then in the end, it's this beautiful kind of moment with his dad. And I'm getting emotional talking about it. But yeah, I think everybody is like, you watch that and you're just like, you feel that. And he's like, can I have a game of catch?
Yeah.
And that was what he refused to do with his dad before he died.
Yeah.
So he has this redemptive moment.
Right.
And I think that's what, in some ways, all sons want, which is like, in adolescence, I said, I'm not going to do it. And the whole story in Field of Dreams is essentially he read a book and Terrence Mann and he said, I'm not going to play catch with you anymore. And I've had clients who've actually said this. They've actually said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to go to church anymore. I'm not going to do what you want me to do in regards to how you perceive me to be. And that was me. I had that moment as well where I said, I'm not going to be you. I'm not going to be that So it's interesting how a movie can kind of awaken that.
Yeah.
Strangely, the movie itself, and I didn't think about this till recently, but the movie itself came out at a time when I was contemplating where I wanted to continue playing baseball.
Yeah.
And it maybe indirectly inspired me to say, you know what, I want to do what I need to do that's relevant to me. And I think maybe we need to give ourselves permission to explore what that might be. But we get locked into these comfort zones where we get stuck and we can't really grow because we're holding on to resentments. And you mentioned this before, kind of anger.
Yeah.
The ways in which that can kind of hold us back and hold us down.
Yeah.
And it's nice to know that we can ask for forgiveness. I asked my dad for forgiveness for not becoming a baseball player. And he just looked at me and he's like, he never said anything.
Never said anything?
I'm sitting there like bawling. I'm just like bawling. I'm like, I'm sorry, I didn't do what you wanted me to do. And he's just like looking at me and he's like, he didn't say anything after that. I think I just needed a moment where I got it out. But then a few days later, shortly before he passed, I was looking down at him and he just smiled. And I was like, oh, I think that's it. And I carried that with me forever. I mean, it's still with me today. Still with me today because it was like reconnecting in the way that I thought I had lost his pride or love or approval or whatever that might be. But I'd have to imagine all of us in some ways carry that history with us into our adult lives. And we're looking for that in a kind of redemptive moment maybe, or whatever that is that helps to unburden us or unlock us from how we've carried our own personal pain in our lives. Now, did you notice that you were carrying anything, a kind of woundedness from the ways in which you related to him?
You know, if you're saying, do I have regrets about the way I treated my father at any time or interacted with him? Only one, and he deserved it. But you know, I have a hard time saying I actually regret it. It was unfortunate. It's regrettable, but I don't carry it around with me now.
Yeah.
You know, he was a great guy and a great father to have, and I'm so fortunate. He just died, as you know, in December, and I was there with him. I'm the only child left, and my brother passed on a long time ago, but and he outlived his wife and pretty much everybody in the family at 96. So I was there when he took his last breath. And you know, as we had he didn't laugh, but because he wasn't in pain. He knew that the end was coming. And he sat there at one point. He looked around. He kept going sort of in and out of the state of I'll call it sleep unconsciousness. I couldn't tell which. Yeah. But at one point, he kind of sat up and he looked around, looked at me, and looked at the door. And he said, "Son of a bitch." And I started laughing because that's so characteristic of him, really, you know. And I said, "Yeah, Dad, son of a bitch," you know. And when after he passed, you know, I was sitting there and I was calling his grandchildren, my children, to tell them that he had passed. And when I left, we used to have a way of saying goodbye whenever he would come here, which was every Sunday. He lived here, and so he would come for dinner. And when he would leave, I'd always tell him, "Be careful." And he'd turn around and go, "Of what?" And I'd go, "You know." And then he'd kind of smile and just get in his car and leave. And so as I was leaving the hospital room, I felt a void in not actually him being able to respond. Now I'm getting emotional. But I turned around, I looked at him, and I said, "Be careful, Dad." And it was just nice.
That's a beautiful moment.
Yeah, it was. It really, the whole, actually, as weird as that might sound to some people, you know, at 96, he had lived a full and a quality life right up until 3 days before. And so it was hard to feel bad for him in that respect. You know, we all have to go. And but it was a beautiful moment for me, and it was very peaceful. There was a chaplain waiting outside the door, and as I walked out, he said, "Do you want to go someplace and talk?" And I said, "No, not really." And he said, "Well, that's your dad lying there, right?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Well, I think maybe we should, you know, go to a room maybe and talk about it." And I just looked at him and I said, no, if you knew my dad, I mean, he lived a full life up to 96 and just died peacefully.
Yeah.
I have nothing to talk about. Yeah. I'm happy with the outcome.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost as if my dad died when I was 21, but those kind of conversations continue inside you in some ways.
Yeah.
You know, the thoughts, the feelings, the memories. There was a great story that I actually did learn from a family member that when my grandfather was an immigrant from Italy, and he wanted to be an opera singer, and he loved Enrico Caruso, and he would listen to his songs, his music all the time. Yeah. And there was one time where my dad was going to be a childhood actor. He was on the Little Rascals, the Argene comedies. Yep. And one of the directors there saw him and he said, I want to make your son a star. So my grandfather invested all this money into it. And then unfortunately what ended up happening, it started and then it stopped because of the Great Depression. But my grandfather lost all this money. And it was interesting because the one memory, I think that it was another family member that told me about this, but my dad saw my grandfather around the corner of the room crying, listening to Enrico Caruso.
Oh, really?
And he said that memory was such an important one for my father because he never, ever wanted to have to experience something like that again. To witness his father going through that or to experience that something on his own, that type of deep sadness and loss.
Yeah.
Loss in terms of putting yourself out there and then having a kind of a catastrophic result. It worked out fine in the end. My dad went on to become an actor and whatnot, and I'm sure my grandfather was proud of him. But it's interesting for me because I was much more like my grandfather, I think, than my dad. He was a very emotional person. In fact, we share the same birthday. He was a very emotional person. He emoted a lot. And I think that's, of course, how I am. I'm an empathic, emotional person, whereas my dad tended to keep things in. But I think he kept it in because my grandfather let it out. So It's interesting how generations you can kind of skip certain personality features.
Well, my father couldn't. It's kind of funny, sad in a lot of ways, but also has it's had its comedic moments. My dad couldn't stand his father, and carried that with him until the day he died. Mm-hmm. He would be here. I mean, just 2 weeks before he died or whatever for dinner, and inevitably, he loved to sit there and tell stories. My dad was a storyteller, and he would tell stories until you, and he would tell them over and over, same stories, until you couldn't stand it anymore. You know, I'd have to drink 2 glasses of wine to get numb to be able to sit there and listen and nod. And then he'd look at me and go, "You've heard this all before." And I'd go, "Yeah," but then he'd go on anyway, the same story.
Yeah.
But inevitably, there would be at least 1 or 2 stories about his father, and what an asshole his father was, and even after he saved his father's life, his father could never. And he would go on and on and on about it. And I gave out, at one time years ago, and when he was in his 70s or early 80s or something, I said, "Dad, the guy's been dead for 40 years. Give it up."
He won't. But you don't.
But you don't.
You don't.
No,
you just don't.
He carried it right to the bitter end, and I mean, he was bitter about his father.
And it's interesting the value of stories. I know we might kind of take it for granted.
Yeah.
Your dad was a storyteller, and that seemed to be something that was therapeutic for him. And maybe kind of a nutrient just overall for him. But it's amazing how we have these stories in our lives. They shape the ways in which we relate to the world, our value system, of course, our identity and self-worth and things like this. So we do want to examine the stories that either we've experienced or that we haven't heard, just to kind of look deeper and to kind of to excavate what that could be and the ways in which it affects and impacts how you see yourself. It is important, and it's something we kind of take for granted. I get to hear it, like I said, in an intake session, I get to hear the history of the person, and then I get to highlight for myself maybe the ways in which these interactions, the events that we're told, might shape a certain diagnosis or a treatment approach that I might apply. But stories are essential, and I think we take kind of for granted the ways in which they impact our emotional life. Mm-hmm. But it also gives us an opportunity, I think, to say, well, what would I do differently? Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be in a resentful way, like maybe your dad was, and say, I'm not going to be like that SOB.
Yeah. He wasn't.
And he wasn't, right. No. But it could be something along the lines of, I understood that my dad operated and he wasn't very vocal with his affection, but I could sense he did love me. There was one time where I was leaving to go to college and I was driving back, and he just leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. He'd never done that before.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was just like, why did he do that? And then I looked back and I remembered, oh, that was when he got his cancer diagnosis and didn't tell me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I didn't know that at the time that he kissed me, but I remember driving off on the cheek, and I remember I was like, oh, and then I looked back and I was like, oh, maybe that was why.
How long after that was it that you looked back and realized that?
It wasn't until years later because I started to kind of think about my life, and I started thinking about relationship with my dad and things like this. And that's why it's important. I'm saying, considering the timeline of that and when that occurred and why that occurred and why that was meaningful. So that's what stories do. And like I said, with Braveheart, I went to go see it in the movie theater because there's something in there that's kind of pulling me. So there's some theme in there. There's some a moment that I relate to in my life.
Was there ever a time with your relationship with your father where one of you or the other or both refused to speak to one another? Did that ever happen to you?
I'd like to say there was, but no, not really. I think we had moments maybe where we weren't as expressive or talkative or engaged, but we kind of, like I said, we connected through sports, we connected through history, we connected through movies. He wrote a lot of screenplays.
I'm asking about, was there a time when, not just, but there was a reason for it, like you were angry, he was angry. Was there a moment that he just cut you off essentially, and you guys weren't gonna talk?
No. I didn't have that. I'd like to think, again, like I only had him up until I was 21.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's many other occasions. Did you have that in your life with your dad?
No, my dad would never allow that. Neither would I. Like my dad made a comment one time. My brother had threatened to stop talking to him or something, and I said, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And he goes, oh, I'm just going to go over and sit on his doorstep until he agrees to talk to me.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way with my kids. I would just never let my kids not talk to me. I'm going to pester them to death.
I think I can understand how that would happen. A kind of a male way of communicating anger can be withholding of love.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, were there moments when I felt like my dad was less affectionate, less... and I think I sensed that if I went 0 for 4. Yeah. He wouldn't talk to me on the car ride home.
Right.
So no, is that like his disappointment in my performance, and it meant something.
But if he would initiate a conversation on that ride home, he would have talked.
He would have talked. Yeah, he would have talked back. And it again, it would have been probably more technical in regards to what happened, not necessarily in regards to my feelings, because we did talk about our feelings.
Right.
But it was more like, well, you could have done this or you could have tried that, and that would have been fine. But I knew when my dad was upset with me, and he usually didn't express anything. Yeah. So there might have been moments of that where I interpreted that he was disappointed with me or something like that, but I never at least interpreted it this way as him cutting me off in order to express some type of resentment or disdain or whatever that might have been or with a larger issue of some kind. But I know how that would happen because anger seems to be one of the sanctioned emotions that we do have as men.
Yes.
Whereas other emotions, we aren't as kind of literate with when it comes to communicating.
It's strange for me. The issue I still deal with, and as you said, we carry this around forever, and I'll probably carry this around forever. I don't dwell on it. I don't lose any sleep over it. That's for sure. But the way my relationship with my father changed, where we were close as could be when I was young, as I mentioned, and we did a lot of things together, despite him not living with me. Yeah. And I idolized him as a young boy, and in my teenage years, I was still very close to him. Yeah. And then this transition came where I became an adult, and we ended up in the same industry, and that was still okay. And then as I succeeded in the industry and got promotions and ranks that were above what he was doing, there became this chasm in us that I don't know whether it was insecurity on his part, just the fact that I was a VP in a company that he wasn't or whatever. And ultimately I was glad to get out of that where we didn't have that between us. Interesting story. We're speaking of stories. We're at his retirement dinner. It wasn't a big dinner, but it was a typical industry dinner, small for our company. And so it was maybe 30 people there or so, or 40 people. And because I was an executive, I was at the head table with him. And so everybody got up and, said something about him, And I got up, and as a joke, because I was actually still so close to my father, as a joke, I said, as everybody knows, there's a lot of competition and tension between my father and I, and nobody laughed. Oh my God. I was like, fuck
that's not
me.
A good joke here.
I'm in trouble. And I started to laugh, and I said, I'm just joking.
Right,
okay. Right. Like, my father's taught me everything that I know. So if to the extent I've had any success here, I owe it to him. Yeah. And then things lightened up. But boy, oh boy, I stuck my foot right in my mouth in the worst possible way. Well,
I think one of the things that I think you and I had discussed before, and I noticed this in the work that I do with my patients, is re-examining the narratives of your life and the ways in which those stories are told.
Sure.
Because we get stuck there. We get stuck on, let's say for me, it might have been for a little while, my dad didn't love me because I didn't become a professional baseball player.
Right.
Or I didn't go on to do what he had wanted me to do, and therefore I am less than or not good enough.
Yeah.
There are plenty of, I think all of us in some ways, male or female, carry these stigmas and taboos in our lives that we say, I can't touch that part of myself because it's inferior or it's inadequate or I'm not enough there. But the value of therapy is re-examining those narratives and memories, pulling them back up, looking at them again and saying, is that true? And then kind of asking yourself, okay, maybe I'm different than my dad. Maybe I have a deeper life purpose and something that's more organic to my calling, whatever that might be. And I know we've talked about this before, but I perceive the profession that I have as a vocation. Yeah. This is what I was called to do, and this is something that I feel uniquely dedicated to in a way that I couldn't have been in that my dad wanted me to do what he wanted me to do.
You want to know my thought on this, John?
What's that?
I'm really glad you didn't become a baseball player.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think you're really, really good at what you do.
Thank you, Kerry.
I mean that sincerely.
Thank you, Kerry.
And I'm not sure you'd have been that good as a baseball player.
I mean, and it's true.
You could have been. I don't know.
And that's just it. It's just,
because your heart wasn't in it.
My heart, and that's what you want to consider is like, where's your passion? And I love sports, but I didn't love it the way my dad did. Yeah. And I think anytime somebody passes something down to you, you have to consider, is this organic to me, or is this something has been kind of passed down or bequeathed to me? Do I want it or do I not want it? And I think what I started to recognize was, while I admire and I love my father for what he was able to do, it is not something that's true and organic to me.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to take into consideration, because his story is not mine.
Right.
And that's why it's important to re-examine the ways in which his life narrative influenced me. But then I have to say, okay, but what is unique to me? What is it that makes me different? What is it that makes me, what is it that's sacred to my own life calling? And you have to deal with a period of unknownness. I don't know what that is. How am I going to figure that out? How am I going to explore that? And it comes from re-examining these narratives and stories in the way that we are right now, so that we can unpack it and say, oh, I can see how that story led to this, and that led to how I see myself and how I related to myself. But when you cross over into the middle, when you go through the middle part of your life and you cross over, you have to say, okay, there's a crisis here. Mm-hmm. Am I going to stay the same person and hold on? Right. Or am I going to awaken to something new? And so I said to myself early on in my life, I said, I need to change. I can't continue to keep operating under the lens of guilt or shame, that influenced how I felt because my dad wanted me to be this and I wasn't.
Yeah.
So, and I think through my own self-exploration and then helping others explore their own lives, it enabled me to get to a point where not only could I allow a space to examine that, I think in a fruitful way, but I could really genuinely feel gratitude and a sense of celebration that I can do that for myself every day, and I can encourage others to do it as well.
Yeah, and hopefully, to some extent, anyway, this platform, those that are watching can hear that and let that sink in. They need to be in touch with that, and I think as you would say, if it's something that's eating at you, you need to seek therapy. and do some self-examination and find somebody who can help you with those kind of feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a lot of what I see is those unexcavated and unexamined parts of ourselves aren't just pathologies related to traumas or loss.
Sure.
They're actually because there's potentials inside of you that haven't, been cultivated. That's what I've noticed. The orientation that I use is one in which a pathology isn't necessarily something that references something pathogenic or problematic, but rather some unlived potential that is speaking to you through a symptom or something that discomforts you. So I think human beings in their essence are filled with potentials, but they haven't been really fully cultivated and examined. A lot of the times we're afraid to go there because we don't know what we'll find. And then maybe to some extent, I might be beholden to actually pursuing it. And I don't know how to do that, but that's the hero's journey.
Yeah.
The hero's journey isn't just about what was lost or taken from you or that you need to get back, but also these unlived potentials inside of you that are seeking your attention. And sometimes they get your attention through something very painful and uncomfortable. And that's my role as a therapist, to uncover what that is with them. Yeah.
Well, I guess one thing I would say to the listening audience is a great book by Leo Buscaglia. And I read it for my first time in, I guess it was the 80s. Anyway, it's called Love, What Life is All About. And I would encourage everybody. In fact, I taught a class here at the university. And even though it was a business class, at the end of it, as a gift to all of my students, I gave them a copy of the book because I said, this is maybe one of the most important things you'll ever read. And for me, it changed my life completely. It just made complete sense how love needs to be expressed. It can't hold it in, and you can't hold these feelings in it. And the irony of it is, for every bit of love that you allow yourself to feel and then express to someone, it's returned a multitude of times. You can't even measure it. And so I always take the time with people that I love, and I love you, John.
And I love you, Gary.
I always take the opportunity to invest in that because the returns are so rewarding. So it's a great book, and I would encourage you to read it. And also, I'm sure John's going to encourage you to get therapy if you think you need it. If you're a son of a father and you haven't communicated love between you and the intimacy that you need from that you have a strong desire for, I would encourage you to take the steps, find the courage to be vulnerable, to take the steps and fill that void with love by taking the first step. And I know that's really difficult to do because I know enough people who have done it, but it's well worth it. John, you've got some last words on this subject?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and thank you, Gary, those sentiments are perfect because so much of what we tend to ignore and neglect in our life isn't really spoken to readily in the world that we live in. So I'm hoping that for our viewers that you can use this as an opportunity to not only maybe be inspired by the ways in which we've told our stories, but maybe for you to find a platform where you can communicate your own. This isn't just important in regards to the ways in which you relate to your father, or if you're a father to your son, but I think also in regards to the intimacy that you have with loved ones around you as well. Would be your wife, partner, whomever that might be in your life that you haven't talked to or revealed your feelings to, or told your stories to. I do agree with Maya Angelou in regards to this great agony that we bear inside of us because there's so many things that haven't been said. And it takes courage to tell your story. So I hope, if anything, you can utilize what we've communicated today as an opportunity to learn and then to maybe share and to find the courage to share because the value of it is astronomical. So please, take what you can from what we've discussed today and maybe apply it to your life in the way that you see fit. But we feel incredibly grateful to have this opportunity to share our stories with you and hopefully to pass along some information that could be valuable.
Yeah, and if you have questions, comments, need some advice on something that's you don't have to go to a therapist for, maybe just to ask a question about the content today, feel free to comment and we will respond. Also, if you enjoyed the content, as I said earlier, and I sound like a solicitor, please do hit the subscribe button. It helps us a lot, and give us a thumbs up. And we're going to see you on the next episode of The Middle. So have a great day.
Great. I'm John Beradino.
And I'm Gary Illman.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Take care.
We're going to talk about some interesting things today related to, I forget.
Fathers and sons. I don't know the Chapman
How
song.
is it? How is it that I keep? How is it that I keep losing the goddamn subject? It happens every time.
I should just highlight it there for you. That'll make it a little easy.
We need big.
Big. Oh
cue
yeah, that's
cards.
right. Cue cards.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
We should do that.
We can have the clipboard.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. So then we got it right there. We don't even need to.
Well,
we don't even need this in the future. We'll just have it up there.